The sun was blazing over the quiet suburban cul-de-sac when Karen struck. Arms crossed, pearl earrings flashing, and her oversized black sunglasses perched like armor, she planted herself in front of my Lexus as though guarding a national treasure. "This car doesn't belong here," she barked, stabbing the air with her manicured finger. I told her calmly that it was, in fact, my car, parked in my own driveway. That only fueled her rage. Within minutes, she had whipped out her phone, dialing 911 with all the urgency of a national emergency. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just some neighbor she could bully. I was the federal interior chief, trained in crisis, policy, and patience. And trust me, patience was running out. The afternoon sun sat heavy above the cul-de-sac, pouring down a honeyed light that made the neighborhood lawns gleam like manicured postcards. It was the kind of suburban calm you could almost hear, the soft hum of air conditioners, the occasional bark of a distant dog, the faint laughter of children bouncing off trampolines 3 houses away. My Lexus sat neatly in my own driveway, its white paint catching glints of sunlight, an unremarkable sight by any rational standard. And yet, for Karen, nothing about the situation was acceptable. Her front door slammed open so hard it rattled on its hinges, and there she was, suburban royalty in a pastel cardigan and oversized black sunglasses, a storm cloud in human form. She marched toward me as though the fate of the neighborhood rested on her shoulders. Her heels clicked against the pavement like the countdown to a bomb, and her arms folded tightly across her chest in the posture of a self-declared sheriff. I had seen this act before, though never so theatrically staged. She stopped short of the driveway, tilted her chin up, and jabbed a finger toward the Lexus. "That car," she hissed, stretching the word into 3 syllables, "doesn't belong here." I blinked once, slowly, as though I needed time to translate. "Excuse me," I said, already sensing where this was going but unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a quick rise. "You heard me," she snapped, her voice rising as though to carry across the cul-de-sac. "That car isn't yours. You can't just waltz into this neighborhood and take someone else's vehicle like we're in some sort of crime drama. This is a respectable community." I studied her for a moment. The sunglasses, the stiff posture, the pearls glinting at her ears, it was less a confrontation and more a performance, and I was her unwilling audience. "Karen," I said evenly, "this is my car. Parked in my driveway, where, generally speaking, cars are supposed to go." My calmness only seemed to feed her fury. Her lips curled as though she had tasted something bitter. "Lies," she declared. "You don't look like the kind of man who drives a Lexus. And even if you did, I've been living here for 15 years and I know every single vehicle on this street. That one, that's new, suspiciously new." She circled closer, peering at the SUV as though it might confess under interrogation. "Besides, we have rules about parking," she added triumphantly. "This driveway is subject to HOA oversight. And I'll have you know, oversized vehicles are not permitted without prior approval." I glanced at the car, then back at her. "It's a midsize SUV, Karen. Not exactly a monster truck. Don't get smart with me," she snapped, stamping her foot like a child denied candy. "If you think you can come in here, breaking rules and flaunting stolen property, you've got another thing coming." I couldn't help myself. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth, which only infuriated her further. Her face reddened beneath the tan veneer. "Are you laughing at me?" she demanded. "No," I said lightly, though the truth was obvious. "I'm marveling at your passion." She let out a sharp gasp, the kind reserved for great offenses. "This isn't passion, it's responsibility. Somebody has to protect the integrity of this neighborhood. We don't need strange cars parked in driveways. It attracts attention." I looked around at the cul-de-sac. Mrs. Henderson 2 houses down was watering her roses. A teenager was riding his skateboard in lazy circles. The only attention this car seemed to be attracting was hers. "Karen," I said, lowering my voice, "I assure you, this car is mine. Title, insurance, registration, everything checks out. But if it'll help you sleep at night, I can show you the paperwork." That, I thought, would end it. Proof has a way of shutting down paranoia. But Karen was not a creature bound by logic. Her chin rose higher, the pearls catching the light like little battle medals. "Don't you dare condescend to me with your so-called paperwork. I know a thief when I see one." Her voice had grown louder, pitched toward the neighboring houses. Curtains twitched. Doors cracked open. The cul-de-sac had found its entertainment for the afternoon, and Karen relished the stage. "Listen carefully," she continued, wagging her finger so close to my chest I had to resist the urge to swat it away. "You are trespassing on community property, operating an unauthorized vehicle, and potentially endangering the safety of this neighborhood." "By parking in my driveway," I said flatly. "Exactly," she barked, triumphant, as though she had cornered me with irrefutable logic. It would have been comical if it weren't so absurd. For a moment, I considered simply walking away, retreating inside, letting her rant to the empty driveway. But something in her expression told me she wouldn't stop there. Karen wasn't the type to let go, she thrived on escalation. Sure enough, she whipped a phone from her pocket, her fingers moving with dramatic flourish. The rectangular glow illuminated her face, sharpening her features into something almost villainous. "You leave me no choice," she announced, punching numbers with deliberate force. "You think you can mock me? Well, I know exactly who to call. The police will handle this." My eyebrows lifted. "The police? For what? Owning my own car? For stealing it?" she spat. "For loitering? For threatening the order of this neighborhood?" She pressed the phone to her ear, pacing now like a general before battle. The performance had reached its crescendo. Around us, the audience grew, neighbors leaning against fences, peeking from porches, phones in their hands ready to record. I stayed still, the picture of calm, because I had learned long ago that nothing unsettles a storm like refusing to blow back. Karen jabbed the air with her free hand as she launched into her report. "Yes, officer," she said with mock politeness that barely covered the venom underneath. "I'd like to report a crime. There's a strange man outside, parked in a stolen vehicle in our community. Yes, Alexis, white, very suspicious. He refuses to leave." Her eyes flicked toward me, triumphant, as though expecting me to crumble under the weight of her call. I met her gaze, unflinching, even amused. She had no idea, not yet, but soon, she would learn the cost of confusing arrogance with authority. And as her voice carried into the receiver, echoing across the cul-de-sac, I realized this peaceful afternoon had just been signed over to chaos, with Karen as its conductor, and me as her unwilling co-star. Karen didn't earn her reputation overnight, she built it brick by brick, complaint by complaint, until she had effectively crowned herself the unelected monarch of the cul-de-sac. If Chapter 1 of her legend had been a minor skirmish over my Lexus, Chapter 2 was the backstory every neighbor knew but few dared to tell aloud, the long, tyrannical reign of a woman who treated our homeowners association like her personal kingdom. You could say Karen wasn't just a neighbor, she was an institution, complete with her own unwritten constitution and a crown invisible only to her. For as long as anyone could remember, she had hovered over this neighborhood like a hawk with a clipboard, ready to swoop down on the slightest infraction. Trash bins left out 2 minutes past pickup. Karen had a photo. Lawn a half-inch too high. Karen had a measuring tape. Halloween decorations still up on November 2nd. Karen would send a 3-paragraph email, CCing the entire board, with subject lines that screamed, urgent, as though the fate of Western civilization hung on a plastic pumpkin. It was no wonder she had managed to grind down the patience of otherwise docile suburbanites until they lived in a state of perpetual caution. Neighbors mowed their lawns not for aesthetics, but for survival. Garbage bins weren't dragged in, they were evacuated under cover of darkness, like hostages rescued from a war zone. Children learned early that skateboards on the sidewalk could summon the Queen herself, storming out with proclamations about noise ordinances and community bylaws. But perhaps the most infamous of Karen's obsessions was parking. She ruled the asphalt like a sovereign, declaring where, when, and how vehicles should rest. Guest cars longer than 3 hours. Illegal. Pickup trucks larger than she deemed appropriate. Forbidden. One family once dared to host a birthday party with 10 cars spilling onto the cul-de-sac. Karen arrived with a whistle, clipboard in hand, threatening to call tow services immediately if the situation wasn't rectified. That party ended early, not because of cake shortages, but because every guest felt like a criminal in their own right. And now here I was, parked in my very own driveway, the ultimate insult to her imagined dominion. What made it worse, at least in Karen's mind, was that she saw herself as more than an enforcer, she believed she was a guardian of suburban virtue. She had once told a neighbor, loudly, at the annual block party, that she was the last line of defense against chaos. Chaos, in Karen's world, being anything that strayed from the meticulously curated magazine spread she envisioned for the community. And that title, self-appointed defender of order, gave her a sense of purpose so inflated, so boundless, that even the smallest deviation was treated as a national emergency. If the cul-de-sac were a kingdom, Karen would be its queen, its general, and its tax collector all rolled into one. Still, beneath her polished image was a streak of desperation. Karen needed to be seen as indispensable. Without her rules, her finger wagging, her late-night emails, she feared she would fade into irrelevance. So she doubled down, year after year, until she became the very caricature people whispered about behind her back. Even the HOA board, those brave souls who technically outranked her, had long since surrendered. Meetings were dominated by her monologues, while the rest sat silently, nodding, too weary to challenge her. To live in this neighborhood was to live under Karen's reign, and to resist was to invite war. That's why, when she marched toward my driveway with the fury of a storm cloud, I knew this wasn't just about my car. This was about her throne, her crown, her fragile sense of power. In her mind, I wasn't a neighbor, I was a usurper. Someone who dared to challenge her narrative of control. And she couldn't allow that. She had ruled unchallenged for years, and one parked Lexus threatened to unravel her myth of absolute authority. Of course, I hadn't been here long enough to experience the full range of her theatrics. I had heard whispers, certainly. Mrs. Henderson, the quiet gardener down the street, once muttered that Karen had fined her for overwatering her hydrangeas. The Johnsons, a young couple, confessed they sold their RV after Karen called it an eyesore every week for 3 months straight. Even the retired mailman, a man who had seen storms, dogs, and all manner of suburban skirmishes, told me, "Son, you'll learn. Around here, Karen's word is law." They had said it half in jest, half in resignation. Now I was learning firsthand. Watching her rant, I realized she wasn't angry simply because she thought my car was out of place. She was angry because my calm defiance undermined her script. Most people panicked when she barked. They scrambled to comply, or at least to placate her. But I wasn't flinching, and for someone addicted to control, that was the greatest insult. She paced like a queen scorned, phone clutched in her hand, narrating her grievances to the invisible police dispatcher who, I imagined, had better things to do than arbitrate driveway disputes. Her words tumbled out with the precision of someone who had practiced. She knew her phrases, her charges, her exaggerated tone. Trespassing, suspicious vehicle, endangering the community, they were her weapons, her ammunition. And with each accusation, I could almost hear the clink of her crown tightening on her head, as though she believed this display of authority reaffirmed her dominion. The neighbors knew better. They peeked from behind curtains, whispering, their expressions caught between sympathy for me and amusement at her theatrics. They had seen this play before. Karen thrived on spectacle, and the cul-de-sac was her stage. Every slammed door, every wagging finger, every proclamation of community standards was part of her act. And yet, like all tyrants, she failed to see how transparent she had become. Where she thought she inspired fear, she mostly inspired exhaustion. Where she imagined herself a guardian, she was viewed as a nuisance. Still, power, real or imagined, had weight. Nobody wanted to cross Karen, not openly. And so, for years, she had gone unchecked, her empire of rules expanding like ivy on a neglected wall. Until today. Because today, for the first time, she had stumbled into someone she couldn't quite intimidate. Someone who wouldn't fold under her theatrics. Someone who, unbeknownst to her, held an authority that dwarfed her HOA throne by miles. As she waved her phone like a royal scepter, I stood still, watching, measuring, letting her dig herself deeper. For a moment, I almost pitied her, this suburban queen, clinging to her power, terrified of losing relevance. But pity only stretched so far. Because behind the absurdity of her performance was something more dangerous, the willingness to waste public resources, to cry wolf, to escalate a neighborly squabble into a police matter simply to feed her ego. And that was the kind of recklessness I had no patience for. So, as Karen pranced about the cul-de-sac, barking her grievances into the phone with the fervor of a ruler defending her crown, I simply waited. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her throne, her crown, her little empire of HOA tyranny was about to collide headfirst with the kind of authority she could never bully, never shame, never control. And when that happened, the queen of the HOA would find herself dethroned in the most public, humiliating way possible. The first wail of the siren cracked the suburban calm like a whip. It started faint, a distant echo carried on the wind, but it grew quickly, swelling into the cul-de-sac with an authority that even Karen's shrillest tirades couldn't match. Her face lit up like a queen watching her knights ride into battle. She clutched her phone tighter, shoulders squared, and turned in a slow, deliberate motion toward me, her lips curling into the kind of smile villains wear in cartoons just before declaring, checkmate. Around us, the neighborhood stirred to life. Curtains that had twitched earlier were now drawn back fully, neighbors leaning into their windows for an unobstructed view. Front doors creaked open, kids abandoned bikes and scooters to gather on lawns, whispering in hushed excitement. To them, this was better than cable, an HOA showdown turned live spectacle, starring their infamous queen and her latest unfortunate victim. By the time the police SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac, red and blue lights flashing across manicured lawns, Karen was practically vibrating with self-importance. She waved them down with frantic, theatrical gestures, as if guiding an airplane onto the runway. The officers hadn't even stepped out of their vehicle when she began her opening statement, pointing toward me with the confidence of a prosecutor delivering her closing argument. "There he is," she cried, her voice projecting like a stage actress in the final act. "That's the man. That's the thief. I caught him red-handed." The two officers, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other younger and clearly still adjusting to the spectacle of suburbia, exchanged a look that hovered between confusion and mild irritation. I could almost hear their inner dialogue. "We left real emergencies for this." They stepped out slowly, hands resting on their belts, scanning the scene with practiced neutrality. Karen rushed to intercept them, her heels clacking like castanets on the pavement. "Officers," she began, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that barely concealed venom, "I cannot tell you how relieved I am that you arrived so quickly. This man," she jabbed her finger toward me like I was on trial, "has stolen a car and is parading it around in our neighborhood as though we wouldn't notice. I demand you do something before he drives off with stolen property." I remained exactly where I was, leaning casually against the hood of my Lexus, arms crossed, expression calm. If anything, her theatrics amused me, and that only infuriated her further. "Sir," the taller officer said, approaching with steady steps, "can we see some identification?" His tone wasn't hostile, merely procedural, but it cut through the circus Karen had staged. She gasped, scandalized, as though asking me for ID was somehow validating her claims. Yes, check his ID. And the registration. He can't possibly prove this car belongs to him. I've lived here for 15 years. I know every car, every driveway. This one doesn't belong." Her voice cracked at the edges, hysteria beginning to seep through the cracks in her performance. I reached calmly into my wallet, pulling out my driver's license with slow, deliberate movements, the kind officers appreciate when tensions simmer. I handed it over without a word, then retrieved my insurance card and vehicle registration. The younger officer took them, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents. Karen hovered, craning her neck to peek, though the officer angled his clipboard away from her prying eyes. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his tone firm but not unkind, "we're going to verify this information. In the meantime, please take a step back." The command, subtle as it was, hit Karen like a slap. She froze, her mouth opening in indignation. "Step back, officers, with all due respect, I'm the one who called you here. I am the head of the HOA, and it is my duty, to ensure the safety of this neighborhood. Surely you can appreciate the gravity of the situation." The officer didn't budge. "Ma'am, please." For the first time in the encounter, Karen faltered. She stepped back half an inch, huffing audibly, before crossing her arms in a gesture of wounded authority. Her eyes darted toward the gathering neighbors, as though seeking validation, but all she found were smirks half hidden behind hands, whispers passed between spouses, and the glint of smartphone cameras catching every second. Meanwhile, the younger officer keyed into his radio, reading out my license and vehicle details. We stood in a peculiar silence, broken only by the static of the dispatch line and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Karen couldn't stand the pause. Silence was the enemy of performance. She began, again, words tumbling fast, her tone shriller now. "You don't understand the type of people we've had drifting through this neighborhood lately. Outsiders, strangers. They park in our driveways, loiter near our mailboxes. I have written several formal complaints to the board, and nothing has been done. Nothing. And now here's this man, bold as brass, thinking he can flaunt the rules. If I hadn't called, who knows what could have happened? A stolen car today, what's next? A burglary, drugs, gangs. The escalation was so wild, so unhinged, that even the older officer's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as though regretting every life choice that had brought him to this exact cul-de-sac at this exact hour. He finally cut her off with a firm, almost fatherly tone. "Ma'am, please stop." That silenced her for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the radio to crackle back. "Dispatch confirms vehicle registered to my full name. Insurance up to date, no outstanding issues." The younger officer handed my documents back with a polite nod. "Everything checks out, sir." I smiled faintly, sliding the papers back into my wallet, then looked directly at Karen. Her jaw slackened, her carefully painted lips trembling as though the words she wanted to unleash had been jammed in her throat. The crowd of neighbors leaned in metaphorically, eager for the next act in this suburban theater. Karen, of course, did not disappoint. Well, of course the paperwork says that," she sputtered, waving her arms dramatically. "Criminals are clever, you know. Forged documents, stolen identities, it's all over the news. You can't just take one piece of paper and assume." "Ma'am," the taller officer interrupted, his patience thinning visibly, "we've confirmed ownership. There is no crime here." But, she stammered, her face reddening, pearls glinting in the harsh flash of red and blue lights. "I know what I saw. This car didn't belong here yesterday. He doesn't belong here today. How do you explain that?" I let the silence stretch, then finally spoke, my voice measured, calm, but with a subtle weight that made her blink. "I explain it like this, Karen. Sometimes a neighbor buys a new car. And sometimes, that car is parked in their own driveway. And sometimes, people who don't know when to mind their own business end up embarrassing themselves in front of the entire neighborhood." Gasps, muffled laughter, and the faint click of more phone cameras filled the air. Karen's face turned scarlet. She opened her mouth to retort, but for once, no words came. She stood there, trembling, cornered not by me, not even by the police, but by her own unraveling authority. And yet, she wasn't finished. Queens rarely abdicate without a fight. Karen was cornered, but like any self-proclaimed monarch, she didn't retreat, she doubled down. Her humiliation burned across her face, red creeping beneath her tanned skin, but her pride wouldn't allow her to accept defeat. Queens never surrender, not publicly. She straightened her cardigan, adjusted the pearls at her ears, and marched right back into the fray as though the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. "Officers," she declared, voice pitched higher than before, "you're making a mistake. A big mistake. I've been head of the HOA here for 15 years. 15. If anyone knows what's happening in this neighborhood, it's me. And I'm telling you, this man is lying." She stabbed her manicured finger toward me again, and for the first time, the older officer visibly sighed. He didn't hide it, either. It was a long, drawn-out sigh that said he'd been through worse but really wished he didn't have to go through this. The younger officer tried to maintain composure, though the twitch in his jaw betrayed the effort. I stayed silent. Sometimes silence carries more power than words. I simply leaned back against my Lexus, arms folded, watching her unravel. That's the thing about people like Karen. They thrive on conflict, but only when their opponent feeds them energy. Take that away, and they spiral. And spiral she did. Her voice climbed another octave as she scrambled for new accusations. He was loitering outside earlier. I saw him standing by the mailbox like he was casing the place. And that car, it's too new. Too expensive. What federal employee can afford a Lexus like that? Explain that. She barked the question like an interrogator, certain she had exposed some dark conspiracy. I raised one eyebrow, still silent, and that only made her more frantic. She turned on the officers again. "Don't you see? He's smug. Smug because he knows he's getting away with something. You should be searching him, searching the car, calling for backup. Do your jobs." Her words cracked like whips in the air, and the neighbors drank it in like theater. A ripple of laughter broke somewhere down the street, quickly muffled, but loud enough for Karen to hear. Her head snapped toward the sound, her eyes narrowing behind those massive sunglasses, but she couldn't pinpoint the culprit. That only made her angrier. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, voice steady but firmer now, "we've confirmed his identification and registration. There is no crime here. If you continue making unfounded accusations, you could be the one in violation." The words hung heavy in the air. For a heartbeat, even the children on their bikes seemed to stop moving. Karen froze, lips parting in shock. To be told she, the queen of the HOA, might be in violation was blasphemy. She sputtered, "Violation? Me? You can't be serious. I'm the one protecting this community. I'm the one keeping it safe." The older officer didn't blink. "False reports waste valuable resources. This could carry consequences." Karen gasped like someone had threatened to exile her from her kingdom. She clutched her pearls, not figuratively, but literally, and let out a noise somewhere between a scoff and a shriek. "Consequences? For me, I am the HOA president. I practically am the law here." She stomped her foot for emphasis, like a child throwing a tantrum at the unfairness of bedtime. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. Still, she wasn't done. She spun back toward me, her voice taking on a new pitch, louder, shriller, more desperate. "And you, don't just stand there. Answer them, tell us who you really are. Because I'll tell you right now, no ordinary man sits there so calm when the police are questioning him. What are you hiding?" Her words carried an unintended truth. I wasn't hiding, exactly, but I was holding back. Patience is a skill, one I had cultivated through years of public service, press conferences, hearings, and bureaucratic nonsense that could break lesser men. Compared to those arenas, Karen's theatrics were child's play. But she wasn't wrong, I wasn't ordinary. And though she didn't realize it yet, her relentless need to push, to prod, to escalate, was going to drag that truth into the open sooner rather than later. I let a slow smile creep onto my face, not mocking, not cruel, just calm. That smile was gasoline on her fire. She practically vibrated with rage. See, she shrieked at the officers, waving her arms so wildly the pearls on her ears swung like pendulums. "He's mocking us. He thinks he's above the law. Do you want people like this in our neighborhood? If you won't act, I'll escalate this myself. I'll call the HOA board. I'll have him fined, evicted, whatever it takes." The neighbors couldn't contain themselves this time. Snickers broke into full laughter, muffled at first, then louder, until even the kids on their scooters were giggling openly. The Johnsons stood on their porch, shaking their heads, filming the entire fiasco with gleeful abandon. Karen whirled on them, shouting, "Stop recording. This is private HOA business." The Johnsons ducked inside, their laughter trailing after them, but the damage was done. The Queen's authority was cracking, her crown slipping. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me as though silently asking how much longer this circus might go on. I gave him nothing, only patience. Let Karen spend herself. Let her burn every last ounce of credibility in front of the entire neighborhood. My silence was a mirror, and what it reflected back at her was madness. But Karen didn't see madness. In her mind, she saw righteousness. She puffed her chest, raised her chin, and barked, "If none of you will do your jobs, then I'll do it for you. I am documenting this entire incident. When the board hears how you all failed this community, they'll know who the real villain is." She gestured toward me with theatrical flourish, like a queen accusing a traitor in court. The officers shared another look, this one sharper, wearier. The older one finally turned to me, his voice carrying the calm professionalism Karen lacked. "Sir, you've been more than cooperative. We appreciate your patience. Is there anything you'd like to add before we clear this up?" For the first time, I considered speaking. My silence had been my shield, my strategy, but the stage Karen had built was now begging for the reveal. Every neighbor's eyes were on me. Even the officers leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering beneath their professionalism. They all wondered the same thing. Who is this man, and why isn't he afraid of Karen? I opened my mouth, choosing my words carefully, my tone deliberate. "No," I said softly, "I have nothing to add." Then I let the pause stretch, just long enough to make Karen lean forward. "Not yet." Her gasp was audible, sharp, scandalized, like the sound of glass cracking under pressure. "Not yet," she repeated, voice trembling with indignation. "What does that mean? What are you hiding? Officers, did you hear him? He admitted it. He admitted he's hiding something." The officers didn't move. Their eyes flicked between me and her, silently weighing the absurdity of her claim against the steady calm of my demeanor. One man standing still, composed. One woman unraveling like a cheap sweater. The balance was shifting, even if she didn't see it. And I knew, deep down, the moment of revelation was close. Very close. Karen had dragged this theater to its breaking point, and soon, whether by her hand or mine, the curtain would rise on the truth she never saw coming. For now, though, I stayed patient. Calm before the storm, calm before the reveal. The air in the cul-de-sac hung heavy, charged like the moment before a storm breaks. Karen's voice filled the silence again, shrill and defiant, trying desperately to seize back control. You see, officers, he admitted it, he's hiding something. This is exactly how criminals act, calm, smug, slippery. You can't let him fool you. Her arms flailed for emphasis, her oversized sunglasses slipping slightly down her nose, though she didn't notice. She was too busy performing for the audience, which by now included nearly half the neighborhood. Phones were out, cameras rolling, everyone glued to the spectacle as though they had front row seats to a Broadway play. And in a way, they did. The taller officer, looking exhausted, gave her one last warning. Ma'am, please stand back. You've made your report, we've verified his information. If you continue, we'll have to document this as misuse of emergency services. His words were professional but firm, the kind of tone you use when patience is officially on life support. Karen gasped, truly scandalized. Misuse. I'm the victim here. You don't understand. This man is dangerous. Look at him. Look at that car. None of this makes sense. She whirled toward me, her pearls swinging like tiny pendulums of rage. Tell them who you are. Tell them why you're really here. I finally pushed myself off the hood of my Lexus and stood straight. The subtle shift in posture was enough to ripple through the crowd. Suddenly, every pair of eyes locked tighter on me. Even the kids stopped giggling. I let the silence stretch, drawing it out, letting Karen twist in it. Then, calmly, evenly, I spoke. All right, I said, you want to know who I am. Karen's head bobbed like a bird, eager, convinced she had cornered me into a confession. Yes, finally, admit it. The younger officer leaned in slightly, curiosity written across his face, though he stayed professional. The older one, hands still resting on his belt, simply waited. I reached into my back pocket, not quickly, not dramatically, just steady and deliberate. Both officers tensed instinctively, their training sharp, but relaxed when they saw the black leather case emerge in my hand. I flipped it open with practiced ease. The gold badge gleamed in the sunlight, official, undeniable, heavy with the kind of authority that no HOA crown could ever compete with. My name, I said clearly, my voice carrying across the cul-de-sac, is full name. I am the Federal Interior Chief of the United States. The silence that followed was electric. You could have heard a pin drop. Neighbors froze mid-breath. The officers blinked, then leaned forward, scanning the badge, their skepticism melting into recognition. They knew what they were looking at. The younger officer's eyebrows shot up, and the older one gave the faintest nod, a subtle acknowledgement of weight. This wasn't forged paperwork or a neighborhood bluff. This was real. Karen, however, couldn't process it. Her jaw dropped, then snapped shut, then dropped again like a malfunctioning marionette. What? She croaked. No. You're lying. That can't be real. That's fake. She took a step closer, squinting at the badge as though she could will it into forgery. Federal Interior Chief. That's not even a thing. That's made up. The older officer spoke for me, his voice clipped, certain. It's real. I've seen these credentials before. He looked at me with professional respect. Sir. The younger one, still absorbing the weight of it, added, Federal Interior Chief. That means, land management, federal property oversight, interagency coordination. He cut himself off, realizing he was explaining to a crowd that had no idea what those words meant. But the reverence in his tone said everything. The neighbors whispered, the words rippling through the group like wildfire, Federal Chief, Government. Someone muttered, holy hell. Another whispered, Karen's toast. A low chuckle spread, quickly stifled but impossible to contain. Karen's face drained of color, then flared crimson again, bouncing between disbelief and panic. No, she stammered, shaking her head. No. This is ridiculous. He's making this up. You people can't actually believe him. He's just a man with a car. A smug man with a car. Her voice cracked, desperation seeping through the bravado. But no one was buying it anymore. The crowd had shifted, the tide turning decisively against her. Even the officers weren't indulging her anymore. The older one turned, his tone clipped. Ma'am, you've wasted emergency resources on a false report against a federal official. That is extremely serious. Do you understand the gravity of that? Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She looked like a fish flopping helplessly on the dock, gasping for air. I didn't know, she whispered finally, her voice small, fragile, stripped of its earlier thunder. I closed the badge case and slipped it calmly back into my pocket. That's the problem, Karen, I said softly, but loud enough for the whole street to hear. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You assumed. And then you escalated. That's what makes this dangerous, not just for me, but for every neighbor you've treated the same way. A murmur of agreement rolled through the cul-de-sac. Heads nodded, arms crossed. Even those who usually avoided conflict seemed emboldened by the moment. Karen's crown had cracked. Her throne wobbled beneath her. She tried one last time, a desperate swing. But the law. I was just enforcing the rules. That's my job. I shook my head slowly. No, Karen, your job is to live peacefully with your neighbors. The law doesn't make you judge, jury, and executioner. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to weaponize the police because you don't like a car in a driveway. The words landed heavy, not sharp but final. A gavel strike. The neighbors soaked it in, some smiling, some outright grinning, all of them savoring the rare sight of the queen dethroned. The taller officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, we're going to let you off with a warning today. But understand, if this happens again, there will be consequences. Misuse of emergency services is not taken lightly. Karen's lips trembled. She looked around, seeking support, but all she found were eyes, watchful, amused, unsympathetic. Her loyal subjects had abandoned her, their silent laughter ringing louder than any words. And in that moment, as she shrank back a step, her authority crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide, I realized the reveal had landed exactly as it needed to. The federal card had been played, and Karen's empire would never recover. Karen stood frozen in the middle of the cul-de-sac, her mouth working silently, as though words had suddenly become a foreign language. For a brief, glorious second, she was quiet, the queen dethroned, the tyrant disarmed. But Karen was never one to surrender gracefully. No, her pride wouldn't allow it. The meltdown began like a hairline crack in glass, barely visible, almost manageable. Then, with one careless push, it splintered into chaos. I didn't know. She suddenly wailed, clutching her pearls as though they could shield her from humiliation. How was I supposed to know you were, that? You don't look like a federal anything. You look like some middle-aged guy in a flannel with a car he doesn't deserve. Her voice cracked halfway, high-pitched and desperate, the performance of a lifetime unraveling in real time. The crowd of neighbors, once silent, began exchanging looks. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. Another shook their head, muttering, "Classic Karen." Kids who had been filming on their phones zoomed in like junior paparazzi, capturing every second of her unraveling. The officers didn't budge. The older one stood solid, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. The younger officer had the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, though he kept his posture rigidly professional. Karen, sensing the tide against her, switched tactics. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble," she said, her tone softening into fake sweetness. "I was just concerned. For the community, for safety. You can't blame me for caring about my neighborhood. I give so much of myself here. I organize the block parties, the bake sales, the garden competition." From the back, Mrs. Henderson, who had lived on the street for 30 years, scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You canceled the garden competition because you lost 3 years in a row." The crowd snickered. Karen's head snapped toward her like a hawk, eyes blazing. "That's not true," she snapped, the sweetness gone in an instant. "You cheated. Everyone knows it." The tension cracked, laughter bubbling through the cul-de-sac, and Karen's face went crimson. She turned back to me, desperate now, clutching at straws. "You have to understand, I thought you were, I don't know, some drifter. That car, parked in that driveway, it just didn't look right. You can't hold that against me. I was protecting the integrity of this community." "The integrity of the community," I repeated slowly, letting the words roll like a stone. "By calling 911 and accusing your neighbor of grand theft auto in his own driveway." She flinched. "I didn't know it was your driveway. The law rules are confusing sometimes. And your car is just so flashy." "It didn't fit." "Flashy." I raised an eyebrow, glancing back at the modest Lexus parked behind me. A reliable SUV, not exactly a Lamborghini in neon paint. The absurdity of her argument drew another wave of chuckles from the neighbors. Karen's eyes darted from face to face, realizing she was losing them, losing everything. Panic flickered in her gaze, her body stiff with desperation. Then, in one wild swing of strategy, she played her most absurd card yet. Her voice dropped low, trembling with faux vulnerability. You're bullying me. The words hung in the air, heavy, absurd, almost comical. Be bullying, I repeated, blinking in disbelief. Yes, she shrieked, clutching her sunglasses like they were a victim's badge of honor. All of you, gang up on me, laugh at me, humiliate me. I was just trying to do my duty, and now look at this mob. You're all cruel. You'll regret this when something really bad happens and I'm not there to stop it. The crowd erupted, not in anger, but in laughter. Even the officers couldn't mask it this time. The younger one let out a short, sharp chuckle before biting his lip, while the older officer cleared his throat too loudly to disguise his amusement. Karen's meltdown spiraled faster now, a tornado feeding on its own chaos. She paced in frantic circles, ranting, "You people don't appreciate me. I keep this neighborhood safe, clean, respectable. Without me, you'd all have trash cans on the wrong days and weeds in your lawns. You'd park RVs on the street. You'd let children chalk the sidewalks like vandals. I'm the reason this place has order." Her tirade grew so wild she accidentally kicked over her own "Keep off the grass" sign, which clattered dramatically to the pavement. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Karen," I said calmly, cutting through her storm, "the only thing you've kept this neighborhood safe from is peace and quiet." The neighbors roared with laughter. Someone clapped. Another whistled. Karen's face twisted, her lips quivering between rage and despair. She stomped her foot like a child denied candy. "This isn't fair," she cried. "You think you can just waltz in here with your badge and your title and make me look like the bad guy? I was just trying to uphold the rules." "The rules. That's what the HOA is about." The older officer finally stepped in, his voice calm but commanding. "Ma'am, the HOA doesn't have the authority to harass neighbors or misuse emergency services. You crossed a line tonight. Be grateful this man is being patient. Most people in his position wouldn't be." Karen opened her mouth, ready to lash out again, but the weight of his words landed. Her chest heaved, her hands balled into fists, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she went silent. The silence wasn't victory, it was defeat, the kind of quiet that follows a tantrum when even the tantrum knows it has. Burned out, I stepped forward, closing the space between us just enough that my words reached her and the crowd alike. "Karen, this neighborhood doesn't need a dictator. It doesn't need someone to weaponize the police because they don't like what they see. What it needs is respect. That's what community is built on. And until you understand that, you'll never have the control you're so desperate to cling to." She glared at me, her chest rising and falling sharply, but she had no retort. The neighbor's eyes weren't on her anymore, they were on me. For the first time, she wasn't the center of attention. And she hated it. Her meltdown ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. She spun on her heel, muttering under her breath, her pearls clinking as she stormed back toward her house. "You'll all regret this," she hissed, though her voice cracked, betraying the hollowness of the threat. You'll see. She slammed her front door so hard it rattled the windows. The cul-de-sac erupted, not in chaos, but in relief, in laughter, in applause. The spell of Karen had been broken, and though the night air still hummed with the echoes of her meltdown, it was clear, the queen had fallen, and the neighborhood was finally free to breathe. The laughter lingered like smoke after a firework, fading only when the older officer lifted his hand, calling for calm. The neighbors slowly quieted, though their grins remained, the air still buzzing with the electric satisfaction of seeing Karen humbled. Her front door had slammed so hard that even the shutters rattled, but for once, she wasn't the one in control. The stage was mine now. I stepped forward, the sound of my boots on the pavement sharp against the hush. My voice carried easily, steady and deliberate, cutting through the night. "Let's be clear about what just happened," I said, scanning the faces in the crowd. A 911 call was made. Police officers were pulled from their duties, lights blazing, sirens blaring, because a neighbor couldn't stand the sight of a car in a driveway. A murmur rippled through the cul-de-sac, shame, agreement, disbelief all woven together. Several people shifted uncomfortably, realizing just how far Karen had pushed the line tonight. I turned toward the officers, nodding respectfully before continuing. "This is no small thing. Misusing emergency services isn't just an inconvenience. It diverts resources from real emergencies. Tonight, while these officers were here sorting out a complaint about my car, someone else could have needed them, someone in actual danger. Think about that." The younger officer straightened, clearly grateful someone else was making the point. The older one gave a slight grunt of agreement. Both men stood taller, their authority mirrored in mine. Karen's curtains twitched in the corner of my eye. She was watching, no doubt fuming, but unwilling to step back into the fire. That was fine. She didn't need to. This wasn't about humiliating her anymore, it was about setting the record straight for everyone. I gestured toward my Lexus, parked quietly and innocently behind me. This car is mine. It's registered to me, parked in my driveway, and yet, because it didn't meet someone else's idea of what belongs, I was accused of theft on my own property. That's not just insulting, it's dangerous. It's a reminder of how easily assumptions can spiral into escalation. A few neighbors nodded solemnly now. The laughter was gone, the weight of my words settled over them like a heavy blanket. I softened my tone slightly, less sharp now, more instructive. Look, every community has rules. I get that, I've worked with more regulations than any of us care to count. But WA rules, I let the words hang, pointed but calm, are not law. They're guidelines, for maintaining order, not weapons to harass neighbors with. They don't override property rights. They don't give anyone the authority to police their neighbors with threats and emergency calls. Mrs. Henderson spoke up, her voice clear and quivering with years of patience finally snapping. That's all Karen ever does, harass people. She called me out for having my recycling bin 6 inches from the curb. 6 inches, like I was some criminal. Same with me, muttered Mr. Thompson, the grizzled veteran who lived across the street. Told me I couldn't fly my flag because it wasn't aesthetically approved. Imagine that, me, a Marine, told I can't hang the stars and stripes on my own porch. A collective groan rose from the crowd, the grievances spilling out now that the dam had cracked. Years of petty tyranny were finally surfacing. I raised my hand slightly, quieting the surge before it became a riot. This is the problem, I said firmly. Rules are meant to guide a community, not strangle it. Respect should be the foundation of any neighborhood. Respect for each other's rights, space, and dignity. Without that, the rules don't matter, they just become weapons in the hands of people who crave control. The older officer finally spoke, his voice low but carrying weight. He's right, we respond to emergencies, real emergencies. Not disputes over driveways or trash bins or cars that don't look right. That's not our job, and it shouldn't be yours to drag us into it. The younger officer added, his tone firm but measured, "Ma'am," he nodded toward Karen's house, knowing she was listening, tonight was a warning. A very serious warning. Misuse of 911 can carry fines, even criminal charges. In making false reports about your neighbors. That's harassment. It ends here. Silence followed, heavy but cleansing. The crowd shifted again, no longer restless but resolute. Heads nodded, arms crossed. They weren't just listening, they were absorbing. I took a slow breath, then let the tension break with a lighter note. So let's agree on something simple. Park your cars, mow your lawns, wave to your neighbors, live your lives, and maybe, just maybe, we'll survive a summer without a 911 call about whose azaleas grew too high. Laughter bubbled again, softer this time, not mocking but relieved. A collective exhale. Even the officers chuckled. Mrs. Henderson clapped lightly, starting a ripple of applause that spread cautiously, then confidently through the cul-de-sac. Not loud, not raucous, but genuine. For once, the unity wasn't enforced by fear of Karen's wrath, it was born from relief, from clarity, from the hope that maybe things could change. The older officer tipped his hat slightly toward me. We're satisfied here. We'll file the call as resolved. His eyes narrowed as he glanced toward Karen's darkened window. But next time, we won't be so patient. The younger officer gave me a respectful nod. Sir, thank you for handling this as calmly as you did. You could have escalated. You didn't. I returned the nod. That's what leadership is, knowing when to stand firm, and when to let things go. The patrol car lights dimmed, the flashing reds and blues finally fading as the officers prepared to leave. Neighbors began drifting back to their homes, still buzzing, still whispering, but calmer now. The storm had passed, though its effects would linger. I lingered a moment longer, leaning against my Lexus, watching as porch lights flickered back on and screen doors creaked open. The cul-de-sac was alive again, but different, lighter somehow. Karen's shadow no longer loomed quite as large. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small smirk. Setting the record straight wasn't just about me, it was about giving this neighborhood the clarity it had been missing. And though Karen was licking her wounds behind closed curtains, her reign had been shaken to its core. The queen's gavel had fallen, but not in her favor. By the time the patrol car rolled away, the cul-de-sac had already begun its transformation. Porch lights glowed warmly, conversations hummed in clusters, and laughter, soft but unrestrained, slipped into the night like fireflies after a storm. The air felt lighter, freer, as though the neighborhood itself had shed a weight it hadn't realized it was carrying. For years, Karen's shadow had stretched long across these homes, her voice dictating where trash bins belonged, what curtains were acceptable, how long a lawn could grow before it was deemed offensive. Tonight, that shadow had been cut down to size. I stood by my Lexus, arms folded, watching the scene play out with quiet satisfaction. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another were suddenly united, bound not by Karen's decrees but by shared relief. Mr. Thompson leaned on his cane, chuckling as he told the Hendersons, "I swear, I thought I'd die before someone finally shut her down." The Hendersons, hands entwined, grinned like conspirators. Kids darted about, phones still in hand, replaying clips of Karen's meltdown with giddy disbelief. Every so often, laughter would spike, sharp and uncontrollable, as someone caught the moment where she'd screeched about being bullied. It wasn't just a neighborhood gathering. It was a quiet rebellion, a subtle revolution. And I couldn't help but enjoy the irony. Karen had tried to assert her control, to tighten her grip on the reins of this cul-de-sac kingdom. Instead, she had united the very people she sought to dominate against her. Her house sat dark and silent, though the curtains twitched every now and then, betraying her watchful eye. She was in there, sulking, fuming, no doubt composing long emails that would never be read the same way again. Her throne was cracked, her crown tarnished. And though she wouldn't admit it, she knew, her empire had fallen. I finally turned back to my Lexus, running a hand across the hood. It gleamed faintly under the streetlight, calm and innocent, as though it hadn't been the centerpiece of tonight's suburban theater. The car had sparked the fire, yet it was just a car, a vessel of irony. Karen had tried to make it the symbol of disorder. Instead, it became the very symbol of her undoing. The neighbors gradually began retreating, offering nods and smiles as they passed. Some stopped to thank me, their words quiet but sincere. "Appreciate the way you handled that," one man said, his voice heavy with the kind of respect that doesn't come easily. Most folks would have lost their cool. "Cool's easy," I replied with a half smile. "Patience is harder, but sometimes, patience makes the lesson stick." By the time the last porch light dimmed, the cul-de-sac had returned to its usual stillness. Crickets hummed. The air carried the faint smell of cut grass in summer. Only Karen's house remained tense, lit faintly by a television glow that suggested she was pacing, sulking, spinning herself into tighter knots. I lingered, letting the quiet settle, reflecting on the strange theater of suburban life. I'd spent years managing crises on federal lands, navigating disputes between agencies, handling emergencies far more complex than a woman with an HOA binder. Yet tonight, the irony struck me hardest. The most exhausting battle wasn't over forests or pipelines or public lands. It was over a car in a driveway. The absurdity made me laugh out loud, alone in the night. I imagined the report Karen might draft tomorrow. It would be full of exaggerations and excuses, misunderstanding, intimidation, bullying. She'd twist her meltdown into martyrdom, cast herself as the brave defender of order, conveniently skipping the part where she'd accused a federal official of stealing his own car. But the neighborhood had seen it. They had laughed, they had whispered, they had applauded. No email or HOA meeting would erase that memory. And that was the real punishment, not a fine, not an official citation, but the slow erosion of fear. For years, her authority had thrived because people gave it power. Tonight, that power evaporated. And once it was gone, it would never return. I straightened, ready to head inside, but paused one last time, looking toward her house. The curtain fluttered again, and though I couldn't see her clearly, I could almost feel her glare, sharp, resentful, desperate. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered the sirens, the flashing lights, the accusations hurled so carelessly. The fear she'd tried to spark. And pity dissolved into something sharper, resolve. Community was about respect, not control. About neighbors, not tyrants. And tonight had proven that even the loudest voice could be silenced by truth. I smiled, shaking my head, and whispered to myself, the one car she couldn't control belonged to the man who oversees millions of acres of federal land. With that, I slipped inside my house, leaving the night to its quiet, the neighborhood to its newfound freedom, and Karen to her crumbling empire of rules. And for the first time in a long time, the cul-de-sac finally felt like home.